Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Saturday, 22 February 2025. It is the 237th anniversary of the birth of Arthur Schopenhauer, who was born in Danzig, then, just as now, part of Poland, though Danzig is the German name for the city and Gdansk is the Polish name for the city that is used today. Will Durant called Spinoza the most lovable of all the great philosophers. Well, I don't think anybody would recommend Schopenhauer as lovable, though I suspect I would have gotten on with him. In fact, I wish I could travel back in time and tell Schopenhauer that he has become a meme in the 21st century, and I think we'd both get a good laugh out of it. Unfortunately, we don't have a time machine, but I did visit Schopenhauer's grave the one time I was in Frankfurt. When historians of philosophy reel off the successors to Kant, this list often consists of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. For example, I have an anthology on German idealist philosophy published by Penguin, and it predictably includes Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. That's it. No Schopenhauer. So, despite being a Kantian, Schopenhauer is treated as a figure apart, not always taken as an integral part of the German idealist tradition. Anthony Flew, in his Dictionary of Philosophy, said of Schopenhauer, quote, Schopenhauer's philosophical reputation has never been assured, either in his lifetime or in more recent thought, partly through his severe opposition to the prevailing and, in his view, corrupting Hegelianism of his time, and partly through his truculent attitude to academic philosophy in general. Unquote. That's an interesting claim to make. If you're insufficiently deferential to academic philosophy, your philosophical reputation is not secure. I disagree with Flew on this. I think that Schopenhauer's philosophical reputation is secure, though Flew also rightly said, quote, it remains true, if regrettable, that Schopenhauer is still more often read for his cultivated aphoristic writings than for his metaphysics, unquote. Here I agree with Flew. Several of Schopenhauer's occasional pieces were translated and gathered into a volume with the English language title Studies in Pessimism, which was widely available, and this was the way that many people made their initial and often their only contact with Schopenhauer. More recently, another Penguin volume, this one specifically of Schopenhauer's writings, collects many of the essays previously circulated as Studies in Pessimism. The reputation for pessimism is perhaps Schopenhauer's most enduring legacy. Schopenhauer is most often remembered as a curmudgeonly misanthropist to whom pessimism regarding the human condition comes naturally. Schopenhauer has attracted other philosophical nonconformists to him. He especially attracted Nietzsche, even though Nietzsche ultimately rejected Schopenhauer's philosophy. One of Nietzsche's early untimely meditations is titled Schopenhauer as Educator, in which Schopenhauer discusses his long search for a philosophical mentor and how finally in Schopenhauer he found someone who could educate him. Nietzsche's untimely meditations are a tribute to his own imperative of untimeliness. For Nietzsche, a philosopher is only worth his salt if he isn't too thoroughly a man of his time, and he knew that the philosophical mentor he sought would have to be an untimely man like himself, and this Schopenhauer certainly was. Nietzsche immediately perceived that Schopenhauer stood outside polite philosophical society. He wrote, quote, attempts have been made to adapt Schopenhauer to this feeble age, or even to employ him as an exotic and stimulating spice, as it were a kind of metaphysical pepper, unquote. Schopenhauer wasn't merely untimely, he was, according to Nietzsche, a help in anyone's struggle against their age. Nietzsche urged, quote, how through Schopenhauer we are able to educate ourselves against our age, unquote. But even Schopenhauer's untimeliness wasn't absolute. Nietzsche also wrote, quote, The perversity of the age came fearfully close to him, for example, in the person of his vain and culturally pretentious mother, unquote. Well, we've probably all heard that Schopenhauer didn't get on with his mother, and that he wrote an unflattering essay on women, included in Studies in Pessimism, that many take as a reflection of Schopenhauer's relationship with his mother. Johanna Schopenhauer wrote several letters to her son that still survive, and some of these are misanthropic gems no less than the writings of Schopenhauer himself. For example, on 6 November 1807, Johanna Schopenhauer wrote to her 19-year-old son, quote, I am acquainted with your heart and know that few are better, but you are nevertheless irritating and unbearable, and I consider it most difficult to live with you. All of your good qualities become obscured by your super cleverness and are made useless to the world merely because of your rage at wanting to know everything better than others, of wanting to improve and master what you cannot command. With this, you embitter the people around you, since no one wants to be improved or enlightened in such a forceful way, least of all by such an insignificant individual as you still are. No one can tolerate being reproved by you, who also still show so many weaknesses yourself, least of all in your adverse manner, which in oracular tones proclaims this is so-and-so, without ever supposing an objection. If you were less like you would only be ridiculous, but thus as you are highly annoying, unquote. And no doubt Schopenhauer was insufferable. He and his mother really should have collaborated together on more studies in pessimism and made it a volume twice the size. That's more biographical background than I give on most of the philosophers I discuss, but I think you'll agree it's pretty amusing, and it serves to show how Schopenhauer stood apart and almost entirely on his own, apart from his family, apart from the philosophical tradition, and apart from his age. Schopenhauer's apartness and the untimeliness Nietzsche attributed to him allow Schopenhauer to speak to us quite directly, almost like a voice outside time. The oracular style comes naturally to Schopenhauer, as his mother's letter implied, as though he had tapped into an artery of perennial philosophy. But a voice outside time would also be a voice outside history. And there's a philosophical sense in which Schopenhauer set himself outside history. Schopenhauer's view of history is strikingly different from that of Hegel, whom Schopenhauer despised, but also strikingly different from Nietzsche and his view of history. Of course, most people come to Schopenhauer for his witty aphorisms, as Flew maintained, and some for his metaphysics of music, which Wagner appreciated, but not many come to Schopenhauer for his views on history. But I come to Schopenhauer for his views on philosophy of history and philosophy of science, both of which deserve a hearing. Hegel had made history central to his philosophical system, and Hegel's philosophy of history remains even today the elephant in the room whenever philosophy of history makes an appearance. Nietzsche was as much at odds with Hegel as was Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche had his own views on history, expressed in another of his untimely meditations on the advantages and disadvantages of history for life. For Nietzsche, history should serve life, while too much history is a sign of decadence and a weakening of the vital powers. Another way to put this, which is not, say, quite true, but true enough, is that for Hegel, history is an end in itself, while for Nietzsche, history is a means to an end, and life defines the end. Schopenhauer wasn't as appreciative of the vital powers. In his essay On Noise from Studies in Pessimism, Schopenhauer wrote, quote, Kant has written a treatise on the vital powers, but I should like to write a dirge on them, for their lavish use in the form of knocking, hammering, and tumbling things about has made the whole of my life a daily torment, unquote. Schopenhauer saw the will to live as a source of suffering, so he certainly never would have endorsed Nietzsche's view that history should serve life. And of course, Nietzsche formulated his views like this partly purposefully in opposition to Schopenhauer. But by that time, Nietzsche was reacting against Schopenhauer and not following in Schopenhauer's footsteps, or even believing himself to follow in Schopenhauer's footsteps, except insofar as Schopenhauer's untimeliness goes. Insofar as history does represent a threat to the vital powers, as Nietzsche thought, Schopenhauer would have welcomed history as a means to denying the will to live. Schopenhauer's explicit treatment of history doesn't occur until chapter 38 of the second volume of The World as Will and Representation, and this chapter is fewer than 10 pages. This relative neglect of history is in itself a commentary on Schopenhauer's view, in which history has only a very marginal role to play. But the marginal role that history has to play is worth contrasting to other philosophers who have had little to say about history. I frequently refer to Descartes as a philosopher for whom history was marginal at best, and Descartes was the model for the scientific revolution to follow, which also had but little interest in history. But while Descartes wrote very little about history and historical knowledge, his philosophy was so influential that eventually it became an important part of history. And in this way, important philosophical schools of thought can shape history not merely by interpreting history, but by making history. In this way, the history of philosophy is woven into the larger story of history, where sometimes its influence is indiscernible, while at other times the influence is obvious and overwhelming. Schopenhauer recognized this and explained the relevance of the history of philosophy to history more broadly understood. Quote, "There are two kinds of history, the history of politics and the history of literature and art. The one is the history of the will, the other that of the intellect. The first is a tale of woe, even of terror. It is a record of agony, struggle, fraud, and horrible murder en masse. The second is everywhere pleasing and serene, like the intellect when left to itself, even though its path be one of error. Its chief branch is the history of philosophy, that is, in fact, its fundamental base, and the notes of it are heard even in the other kind of history. These deep tones guide the formation of opinion, and opinion rules the world. Hence, philosophy, rightly understood, is a material force of the most powerful kind, though very slow in its working. The philosophy of a period is thus the fundamental base of its history." Unquote. What Schopenhauer is saying is that history is laying it down for the rest of history, which more or less follows the baseline for which philosophy is responsible. For Schopenhauer, then, history is an epiphenomenal expression of philosophy, and it's philosophy that is fundamental. If I wanted to, I could show how close this is to Hegel's view, which is ironic given Schopenhauer's low opinion of Hegel, but that's not what I want to talk about today. Schopenhauer has a unique view of history that differs from others like Descartes and Nietzsche, for whom history is also marginal. Schopenhauer begins his account of history with the familiar idea that the facts of history are innumerable. But Schopenhauer recognizes that the facts of history aren't organized like those of the facts of the natural sciences. He says that history is a rational inquiry, but not a strictly scientific one. Almost a century before Windelband and Rickert, Schopenhauer gave an ideographic account of history as consisting of unique events that cannot be subsumed under universal concepts. Despite this conception of history as innumerable facts uncoordinated by any law or principle, so that each and every fact must be accounted for individually, Schopenhauer presents us with a strong form of what I will call historical categoricity. I'll try to explain what I mean to this. According to Schopenhauer, quote, "If we have read Herodotus, we have already studied enough history from a philosophical point of view, for everything which constitutes the subsequent history of the world is already there," unquote. In other words, for Schopenhauer, history is categorical, and Herodotus is the model to which all other models are demonstrably isomorphic. He allows that this is from a philosophical point of view, so that from an independent historical point of view, historians can continue the business of history, of writing histories, but nothing philosophically novel will be found in their efforts. Everything that has and can happen in history is to be found in Herodotus, and the rest of history is superfluous from a philosophical perspective. Herodotus, then, is a sufficient model of history. Presumably, any other adequate history could serve just as well, but Schopenhauer didn't say whether he thought Thucydides, Gibbon, or Ronca could serve equally well up to isomorphism, as the logicians would say. So when I say that Schopenhauer presents us with a form of historical categoricity, I'm talking about the metalogical property of categoricity. The most familiar metalogical properties, which are also called metamathematical properties, are consistency and completeness. And it's easy to explain consistency and completeness in relation to each other. They have a kind of symmetrical relationship. If we make a distinction between syntactical consequence, which is logical derivation without any reference to meaning, that is to say, syntactical consequence is about provability, and on the other hand, I should say, semantical consequence, which is about truth preserving, so it's about truth rather than about proof, then we can say that consistency is when all that is provable is true, or that syntactical consequence entails semantical consequence. Contrariwise, completeness is when all that is true is provable, or that semantical consequence entails syntactical consequence. If this is unfamiliar to you, you'll do fine with your intuitive conceptions of consistency of completeness, where I could say that consistency is never violating the law of non-contradiction, and completeness is not missing out on anything that's true. Consistency and completeness are properties of formal systems. Categoricity is another metalogical property that a formal system might have or not have. For a formal system to be categorical, it has to have at least one model and not more than one model. That is to say, a categorical formal system has one and only one model. Strangely enough, it was the American pragmatist John Dewey who came up with the term categoricity, suggesting it to Oswald Veblen. Before Dewey's suggestion, Veblen had called the metalogical property in question sufficiency, and this had a certain intuitive tractableness to it. We could say that for Schopenhauer, Herodotus suffices for history. It's all the history you need to know. If we think of history as a formal system, for Schopenhauer, history is categorical, and Herodotus is the one model that suffices for history. If Schopenhauer is right, any other history can be shown to be isomorphic to Herodotus. That is to say, any other history can be shown to be equivalent to Herodotus. Histories may look distinct, and outside any consideration of isomorphism, they may be distinct, but up to isomorphism, they are equivalent. To say that two histories are isomorphic is to say that they have the same structure. That is to say, they are qualitatively identical, even if they are numerically distinct. In my immediately previous episode on Copernicus and formal symmetries of history, I also mentioned the distinction between a numerical and qualitative identity to illustrate the cosmological principle, since any part of the sky we observe will be, according to the cosmological principle, qualitatively the same as any other observation of the sky, even though no two observations of the sky are numerically the same. In other words, the cosmological principle is a principle of astronomical isomorphism. Schopenhauer's conception of history is effectively a principle of historical isomorphism, or, as I called it earlier, historical categoricity. Despite his idealism, Schopenhauer gives us an essentially naturalistic form of historical categoricity, but the idea of a non-naturalistic historical categoricity could be said to characterize most history prior to the modern era, when every mundane detail was seen as a symbol for a higher truth. This was especially true in regard to medieval historiography, though the extent to which it also applied to ancient history is an interesting question, and especially interesting insofar as Schopenhauer identified Herodotus as the model of history. I'm not going to elaborate on this at the moment, but it's something to think about, and perhaps I'll return to it someday. The 13th century French work, Histoire ancienne jusqu'à César, embodies an ahistorical conception of history in which nothing essential changes, in which the world has always been what it is and will always be as it is. The Fêtes des Romans continues this tradition, further elaborating the ahistorical conception of history and institutionalizing what Huizinga would call historical ideals of life, doing so in the form of the life of Julius Caesar, which is taken as the paradigmatic historical ideal of life. Only the relationship between past and present was not exclusively the emulation of past ideals, but also the transformation of the past into recognizably present forms, so that the past is no longer past, but is an embodiment of the present in an altered form. It has the same structure, even if it is numerically distinct. We see this in medieval art, which derives much of its charm from clothing all stories from any and all periods of history in the same medieval garb. At least that's one of the things I most appreciate about medieval art. The non-naturalistic context of this conception yields, not surprisingly, an ahistorical conception of history, which sounds paradoxical if anything does. But in its ahistorical historical consciousness, the Middle Ages was not without historical consciousness, but rather possessed an historical consciousness that did not know itself to be such. This is a paradoxical historical consciousness, to be sure, but no more paradoxical than the modern historical consciousness that sees nothing but progress while committing atrocities on a scale previously unknown to history. It may be that all forms of historical consciousness are paradoxical. Certainly there are aspects of Schopenhauer's conception of history that are paradoxical. I am, in fact, presenting Schopenhauer's view of history in an almost spectacularly paradoxical way by calling it a form of historical categoricity. One of the most interesting things to me about Schopenhauer's conception of history is that it demonstrates that there is more than one way to find nomothetic rigor in history. In the absence of the form of abstraction employed in natural science, remember that Schopenhauer said in the beginning of his chapter on history that the organization of historical facts is not like the organization of facts in natural science. History unwittingly makes use of the forms of abstraction employed in the formal sciences. The natural science approach would subordinate the unique events of history to general concepts, which would transform history into a nomothetic discipline, if only these methods could be applied in this context. And if history would be a science, then this is what it would seem that it must become in this particular narrow conception of science defined by the empirical or natural sciences. Schopenhauer, however, denies this of history, as did Dilthey, Hildebrand, and Rickert, and many others who have also denied this of history. History for these thinkers is not to be understood as events falling under general concepts. General concepts are for the natural sciences, and they yield nomothetic knowledge. History is about what's unique, and the delineation of the unique events of history yield ideographic knowledge. Schopenhauer's surprising twist on the ideographic, which latter concept wasn't introduced until well after his time, is that history is unique, but it's also categorical. And that means that other histories, that is to say, histories other than Herodotus, could be shown to be isomorphic to Herodotus. This is the kind of reasoning we find not in the natural sciences, but which we find in the formal sciences. The approach of the formal sciences is to conceptualize unique events as tokens of a type that are not subordinated to a general concept, but rather are exemplifications of a formal concept. If Schopenhauer was wrong, and history is not categorical, then there is no unique model of history, and we may need more than just Herodotus to understand the totality of history. When an unprecedented event or events disrupt the historical process and redirects events onto a new course, Herodotus may no longer serve. It may no longer be sufficient. But other works that describe, for example, a world in transition, may provide the models needed. So it may yet be the case that each era of history and each kind of era in history has its own unique model, which in this case means one paradigmatic history for each period and for each geographical region. This is more fragmented than Schopenhauer's historical categoricity, but is also more likely to be adequate, And we can still obtain a model for the totality of history from the conjunction of the several models of several different kinds of history. I had hoped in this episode to also discuss Schopenhauer's philosophy of science in relation to his philosophy of history. Schopenhauer's philosophy of science doesn't get much love, but I think he was closer than anyone else in the 19th century to understand exactly how science functions. But I think I have said enough for today, and if the spirit moves me, I'll return to Schopenhauer in an addendum on history and science, because for all I've said, there's still a lot more to say. Happy birthday, Arthur Schopenhauer, and thanks for listening.